Hi, this is Kathy English, curator of Revelstoke Museum and Archives. This is my third try today to put our brown bag history talk from Farwell to Revelstoke on Facebook Live. Let's hope this one works. This was our first brown bag history talk of the season. We had a very small audience, and then we did it on Zoom, and now hopefully on Facebook Live. We wanted to celebrate the 135th anniversary this year of the creation of the town site of Farwell. This is a Sinixt First Nations family. It's important to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Sinixt First Nation, and this is also considered traditional territory of the Okanagan Nation Alliance, the Secwepemc, and the Ktunaxa people. And it's important to recognize that when the settlers came here in the 1880s, they were not coming into an empty landscape. There were already people living here. So this is Farwell, A.S. Farwell, the man that we were named after, that the original community was named after. And he was a surveyor and civil engineer from England. He came from Devonshire, England, born there in 1841, came to Victoria in 1864. He was doing surveying on Vancouver Island and in the Lower Fraser Valley, and he wintered over in the Big Eddy area in 1871 and 1872, working with the Walter Moberly's survey party. And they were even at that time looking for potential routes for the railway across Canada. He was also the Surveyor General of BC from 1873 to 1878. It's possible that he actually was with Farwell or with Rogers at some point. He certainly knew that the proposed railway was going to go through Rogers Pass, named after the surveyor Major Rogers, and he knew that this would be potentially a major center for the Canadian Pacific Railway. So I think he thought that he would do an end run around the CPR, and he applied for a land grant in this area on October 20th, 1883, with the provincial government. And the railway filed their plan probably pretty close to the same time, maybe either just shortly before or shortly after. There's some question about the exact date of when their route plan was approved. But the crucial thing here is that the provincial government was treating this land as if it was not in the railway belt. And the railway belt was created by the Dominion or federal government to put the land sort of within the line of the Canadian Pacific Railway under federal jurisdiction, sort of 10 miles on each side of the railway. And then it was up to them how they would distribute that land. In a lot of cases, they gave it directly as grants to the Canadian Pacific Railway Company. So the railway company came here assuming that this would be their land. And Farwell, as I say, had applied for his grant with the provincial government. So that's where it got into some trouble. The railway company was expecting to be able to have control of this land, sell whatever land they wanted, build their yards and shops wherever they wanted. Whereas Farwell had his own plan. He paid out to his town site, paid for his land grant in uh, later in 1884, and then immediately started laying out his town site. And his town site map is dated 1885. The Farwell owned a lot more land than that. He owned quite over 1,000 acres of land in this area. And but he and that included most of what's now Columbia Park and sort of the bench above the where Victoria Road was showing going through there. So he owned quite a bit of land in this area under his grant. His idea was that the railway would, that he would sell them his land in the area that's now Woodenhead Park and where the A&W and McDonald's are. And you can see his actual town site was laid out on Front Street, just south of the railway bridge. And so the main street was Front Street, was Douglas Street, and George is what is now 3rd Street, James is 2nd, and John is 1st Street. And it's just a fairly small, compact town site. The Victoria Road goes through at the base of the hill above where the current courthouse now sits. But his plan was that there would be a lot of room for expansion on his other lands, that there would be room for forest industry and all sorts of other industry in this region as well. So Farwell's plan kind of came awry, and the CPR refused to deal with him, refused to buy his land. And it ended up in a court battle between the Dominion government and Farwell. It was actually, the court case was actually called the Queen versus Farwell, or the Regina versus Farwell. And it kind of went back and forth in the courts for about 10 years. And even a couple of years after that, people still couldn't get clear title to the land. It was 1897 before people could get clear title, but definitely held up progress in the area. This is Front Street in Farwell's town site. This is the main business street. This would be taken in 1885. The hotel up front is Columbia House, was owned by W.M. Brown, and you can see that a lot of the buildings are, not really good construction. They were thrown up fairly quickly to accommodate the railway workers in the area. So we had things like hotels, general stores, restaurants, barbershops, brothels. That white tent that you can see, actually the sign in front of it says red light. So it was definitely a Wild West town. You can see that there's some burnt out snags there. There'd been a fire on Front Street in May of 1885. It took out quite a few of the buildings that had already been constructed there, but the town was rebuilt within 3 weeks. So it really tells you how what kind of construction was going on there. It was very Wild Westy at the time. This is showing the railway bridge in 1885 during the construction of the bridge across the Columbia River, and the driving of the last spike on November 7th, 1885. And of course, we're coming up to the 135th anniversary of that event too. Donald Smith, one of the directors of the Canadian Pacific Railway, with the spike maul in his hand, and behind him is Edward Mellandane, who is looks about 12, but he was actually about 17 at the time, had left his home in Victoria and had planned to join the Riel Rebellion, but got to hear and discovered that it was over. So he hung around and ran a little Pony Express service between Sicamous and Farwell. He ended up being at the ceremony, and because he was small enough to wiggle his way to the front of the photograph and be part of Canadian history, he went on to found the town of Preston, BC. It was really the railway that created the town site in Revelstoke. So it was very much part of why the town was developed. This is the Northwest Mounted Police in their barracks at the top of Douglas Street Hill in 1885. And the man in the white helmet in the front of the photograph is Colonel Sam Steele of Fort Steele fame. So the Northwest Mounted Police were here to uh, really look after federal law. And the federal law at the time was that there was no liquor sales in railway construction area. So, they were generally keeping law and order, but one of the big things that they were dealing with was liquor sales and in this region. So the problem with that is that there was also a provincial police force in the area, as represented by Magistrate Gilbert Malcolm Sproat, who actually happened to be a business partner with Farwell. So there was definitely some collusion going on. I'd say a fair bit of conflict of interest, but in any case, Gilbert Malcolm Sproat was representing the provincial government in town, aided by Jack Kirkup, known as Big Jack Kirkup, who was a provincial police constable here. So they were enforcing the provincial law, which said that anybody with a valid liquor license could sell liquor, especially like the hotel owners and the saloon owners. Whereas the Dominion Police, the Northwest Mounted Police, were saying that there was no liquor sales in the railway construction zone, of which Farwell was part. So obviously there was a conflict there. It ended up with police constables actually arresting each other. It's outlined in a bit more detail in my book, Brown Bag History, Revelstoke Origins. Quite a funny story, but it's definitely a good example of that conflict between the two levels of government, federal and provincial. This is a bridge that was built by Gustavus Blinn Wright, who was a road builder who built the tote road between Sycamoose and Farwell, and built this little bridge across the Columbia to bring supplies. And he actually created it as a toll bridge. You can see the little toll booth on near the right side of the photograph. And then you can see Front Street on the riverbank. And this photograph was taken probably from the hill above Douglas Street, looking north along Front. And by that time, the railway bridge has been completed. You can still see the roof of the Columbia House on Front Street as well. This is a photograph taken by Richard Truman, who's a well-known BC photographer. It was taken in 1894 on Front Street. You can see the streets a little bit more established by then. There's the big hotel at the end, is the Victoria Hotel, and you can see H.N. Corsier's general store on the right of this photo, or at the left of this photograph. This is George Laforum's pack train. George Laforum was a mining packer in the Big Bend, and he had a train of several animals that were taking supplies up into the region. The Oriental Hotel was one of several big hotels on Front Street. It was built by John Stone, originally John Stromdahl. He was one of quite a few Swedish immigrants that came through this area. A lot of them settled in Minnesota and then came into Canada and traveled across with railway construction across Canada. And he was doing hotels and restaurants along the way. His son, John Albert Stone, who was about 17 at the time, his father asked him to come to Revelstoke to oversee construction of their hotel. And he actually walked from Beavermouth to Revelstoke in the spring of 1884. It took him 4 days to walk. There was no road, a trail, no rail line at that time. So we got here and to oversee construction. The original hotel was even smaller than this one. And the second floor was what they called a ram pasture, where men would just take their bedrolls and roll them out and sleep on the bare floor. Was later rebuilt and then rebuilt again to become quite a big 3-story hotel. This is Front Street around the late 1880s, and you can still see the Columbia House Hotel is still there on the right of the photograph. And this photograph of Front Street was taken around 1908, and it's probably a funeral procession. They're coming down Front Street. They would have gone under the railway bridge and then up the hill to the cemetery. You can see the street is a little bit more built up by then. And you can see the big hotel at the end. That was the Central Hotel. The Central Hotel was built by the Abrahamson family, another Swedish family that came across and traveled across the country and established the hotel here. And their original hotel in 1885 was nothing more than a tent, and they added some wood to the sides of it to winterize it. But they eventually built and rebuilt again until by 1908 they had this big 3-story hotel. It was gone by 1920. They kind of fell prey to prohibition. A lot of the big hotels were really running on their bars more than their rooms. So when they weren't allowed to sell liquor in bars, it was kind of a death knell for a couple of the hotels in town, and it was eventually torn down. By then, the town had really shifted away from Front Street. This is one of the brothels on Front Street. This picture was probably taken in the early 1900s, and as I say, either Front Street or Douglas, there was red light houses through on both of those streets. You're not sure if you can tell, but there's a couple of the paintings on the walls are nudes, which you definitely wouldn't find in a middle-class Revelstoke home. But there were quite a few women who were working as prostitutes in early Revelstoke. The 1900 city police book has about 100 women who were charged during the year on charges of prostitution, usually charged under Bylaw 9, which was a bylaw concerning morals and public convenience. So it was definitely part of the culture, especially in the lower part of the town and in the Front Street, Farwell settlement. So now we shift to Revelstoke. And where did the name come from? Well, we're named after this gentleman, Edward Baring, who was the first Lord Revelstoke and manager of the Barings Bank in England. They had originally been cloth merchants in the family and ended up with the international trade, ended up in the banking business. The Canadian Pacific Railway had sent their manager, or President George Stephen, to England looking for backers of the company. They were at a point where they were practically bankrupt after the big expenses of building the railway, and they needed financial backing. They had a big stock issue, and Edward Baring of the Barings Bank agreed to purchase that and become one of their major shareholders. It really got them out of a bind. The Canadian Pacific Railway asked the Post Office Department of Canada to change the name of the community from Farwell to Revelstoke. Revelstoke was the peerage name of Edward Baring, who was the first Baron, first Lord Revelstoke. There was actually a letter written by William Van Horn, who at the time was the vice president of the CPR, to the post office department. And he said, "We propose to name our station at the second crossing of the Columbia River, Revelstoke, so called after the head of the firm of Barings, who was one of the trustees under our first mortgage. The place in question will be one of our division points and a place of some importance, and providing you have no objection to the name selected, we will adopt it from this out. The present name of the town at this point is Farwell, called after an adventurer who squatted there." So Van Horn was making short shrift of Farwell, called him a squatter and an adventurer, negating the fact that he was actually a provincial surveyor and had a legal deed from the province of British Columbia. But the post office department agreed to this request and wrote saying that they would undertake to make the change you ask without further delay. That is, have the Farwell post office called Revelstoke, which will have one advantage at any rate. It will give us a name, whereas the other, Farwell, amounted to nothing at all. And that name change took place on June 1st, 1886. So the town was officially known as Revelstoke at that time, although I think a lot of people continued to use the name Farwell. The Farwell area became known as Revelstoke, and the CPR station area became known as Revelstoke Station. So the railway company, because they weren't agreeing to deal with Farwell in any way, shape, or form, they moved their station and yards outside of his land area to where the station and yards are now. This was their first station, just a little bit east of where the station is now. And it probably, well, maybe not have been the very first station, but it was one of the early ones that was built in the area. So by 1905, they had built their new station. And you can see in this photograph, they even had a big hotel that was built above the station as well, the CPR Hotel Revelstoke. And so this became the center of the railway, and it was a divisional point. It was one of the major centers in the interior for the Canadian Pacific Railway. So a lot of the businesses were finding that it was very inconvenient for them being down on Front Street, having to arrange to get their goods from the station down to Front Street. They were having to pay extra shipping. They had to arrange for horses and carts to transport their goods. There was actually even a road built called Government Road, which is an angled street, angled from about where the Lord Co is now in the Alpine Village Mall, angled right through past where Wolsey Creek Restaurant is now, and cut the school property where the old school restaurant and the distillery is, sort of cut that property on an angle as well. And it was a bit more direct route down to Front Street. But a lot of the businesses weren't very happy about being so far away from the station, which was the only way to get their goods into town. So businesses did start shifting up. The whole Farwell dispute really stopped or made things a lot slower in terms of the growth of the community. In a normal scheme of things, the town probably would have become a city by the late 1890s or late 1880s, early 1890s. But it wasn't until 1899, once all of the lawsuits had been settled and once people could get clear deeds, that the city was really able to move forward with incorporation. So Revelstoke was incorporated as a city in March of 1899. Yeah, 1899, and this is the first city council led by Mayor Florence McCarty, who, in keeping with his new standing as a mayor, built his beautiful new house at the corner of 3rd and Mckenzie. It's still there now. So this was Mckenzie Avenue in 1898. It's just starting to really be developed. You can see that the town is kind of burnt off, or the mountain is burnt off. Mount Revelstoke had a fire on it probably in the early 1890s that had taken all of the timber off of the mountain. The town is just starting to develop. The building that you can see on the right is only about where the Big Bend Cafe is now on Mckenzie, sort of just next to the CIBC. So not much built on the street yet. You can see a spire there. That was the Catholic Church built where the Royal Bank is now. And the street itself had to be built up quite a bit. It was quite swampy. So it took a while for Mckenzie Avenue to really take its fore as the business street. There were several buildings across the tracks close to the station. This was a C.B. Human Company, who had a general store. And this was their first location in the early 1890s. The Bourne brothers had a hardware store, general store, also on the road near the station. And they also had the little building to the right, the lower building there is actually called the Revelstoke Station Post Office. As with the sort of separated community, there were actually two separate post offices for a while. There was the Revelstoke Post Office on Front Street and Revelstoke Station Post Office close to the station. And a lot of those duplications took place for quite a while. There wasn't a unified post office until 1901. And the Bourne brothers later built another store right in the downtown. And Frank McCarty, the first mayor, also had a business block on the road to the station. He was a butcher, so he had his butcher store. There was also a drugstore and Lawrence Hardware in the building as well. So the businesses started to shift onto Mckenzie Avenue, and it started to be built up as the downtown. There's quite a difference between that 1898 photograph and this one. You can see how the town is really built up by then. It's really become an established town. There's a lot more brick buildings on it. This is definitely recognizably Revelstoke, whereas the other one wasn't so much. So this is by 1910, 1915, there really wasn't much left of the downtown area on Front Street. It really had all shifted up here by then. A lot of people who had established stores on Front Street had moved them up here. Some of them actually moved their whole buildings up. Some of them had new buildings built up in this part of town. It definitely a shift. So by 1910, there was still a few businesses on Front Street, but it was really dying out, and the downtown did shift. It's kind of interesting that when you look at our downtown today and realize that our downtown is here because of a land dispute between Farwell and the CPR and the Dominion government. Another photograph showing the snow plow on Mckenzie Avenue about 1915 or so. The building on the corner where Revy Outdoors and the clinic building was Burns Meat Market. You can see the CB Hume General Store on the corner, and where the Roxy is now, it was originally built as Lawrence Hardware. There's a hand-colored postcard from 1904. The Imperial Bank at Mckenzie and First, where CIBC is now, was just under construction at that time. And the smoke that you see around the left of the photograph was the Revelstoke sawmill. It's not tons of buildings yet, probably not much beyond 5th Street really at this time. The upper part of town was really just starting to develop. There were more homes being built in the area because people who were working for the railway were wanting to live in this part of town, a little closer to the station, and closer to the new downtown as well. This is the CB Hume and Company general store. This is, we saw their earlier building across the tracks, and they purchased the property where the Catholic Church was and built this big new brick building in 1903. And it was built of Revelstoke brick. CB Hume actually owned their own brickyard here as well. By 1910, this store was recognized as the largest department store in the interior of British Columbia. And there's the grocery department, well stocked, with some lovely chinaware on the left-hand side there on the shelves. This is First Street around 1915. The Bourne Brothers General Store, which is now Style Trend, you can see on the corner. It was built in 1912, and that was Bourne Brothers that had also been across the tracks and built their big new store on First Street. So you can see that this was really becoming First and Mckenzie had really become the downtown core by then. As a little later photograph from 1940, you can see the City Hall is in there. And Manning's, I really like to show people pictures of Manning's because not everybody is aware that it started its life as a candy store and a candy factory. And we have some of the original chocolate molds and the candy boxes here in the museum. But it's been a Chinese restaurant since 1955 when the Kwong family took it over. And it's changed hands several times, but is still a Chinese restaurant since 1955 and still has the name Manning's, or now New Manning's. So it's kind of neat how that business evolved. As the residential area of Mckenzie Avenue from 3rd Street, and that's the McCarty house on the corner. It's been changed. The corner turret is no longer there, but it's always a beautiful home. And you can see the spire of the Catholic Church would be moved there from its original location. And of course, our beloved Mount Begbie. One of the things that happened with the whole the two communities, the Farwell community and the Revelstoke Station community, was a duplication of services. And the fire department was originally established on Front Street in 1892 by a group of local citizens. And immediately there was complaints that there was, from the people who were living closer to the station, that they didn't feel that they were going to be getting adequate fire service with the station all the way down on Front Street. So by 1897 or 98, they actually established a second fire brigade. So Revelstoke had two fire brigades, the one based on Front Street and the other one based on the back end of City Hall. And when they rebuilt the City Hall in 1939, they actually built the fire hall into the new building. So it stayed in that location until it moved to the current location for the fire hall. But this was Fire Brigade number 2. And the two brigades didn't join forces until 1922. There was a bit of a gap because the city wasn't incorporated until 1899. There were a lot of services that normally would have been sort of provided by the city that were not being provided. One of those was water, light, and power. So there was a private company that was incorporated in the 1890s called the Revelstoke Water, Light, and Power Company, headed by William Cowan. And it was his company that was responsible for building the first dam on the Illecillewaet River in 1898. Once the city was incorporated, they bought the Water, Light, and Power Company in 1902, so they took it over as a city resource. Before incorporation, the Board of Trade, or now known as Chamber of Commerce, was sort of operating as a de facto government. Here's a nice little panorama of Revelstoke taken from Mount Revelstoke, probably in the 1940s. You can see that the Trans-Canada Bridge, which was built in 1961, is not there, but it's a nice little panorama of the city. The hospital was built on land which is now part of the Alpine Village Mall, where Save on Foods is. The original frame hospital was built in 1902 and then replaced with a brick one in 1912, 1913. And it was sort of seen as kind of a central area. It wasn't right downtown, but it wasn't in the Farwell settlement. So it was kind of a little bit of a compromise between the two areas. You could actually see Government Road running through there with the cenotaph on the left side of Government Road. Once they closed Government Road, they moved the cenotaph over to where it is now. The courthouse was built where it is now because that was provincially owned land. The original courthouse had been built on that site in 1897. And when they made the decision to replace it, they stayed with that land without really considering, where the downtown had shifted by then, but they kept it on that provincially owned land that they already were using for the courthouse building. And the post office, which of course is now Revelstoke Museum and Archives, was built on this site in 1926. But the site had actually been chosen in 1910 by Prime Minister Laurier. He had come here on a visit and was given 3 locations to choose from. This was the one that he chose, but he actually waited until he got on the train out of town and sent an email, or sorry, an email. He sent a telegram back to town indicating which site that he had chosen. And this was the one. We're not really sure why he chose, and I'm not even sure where the other locations were. I'm assuming probably one of them was a little closer to Farwell and one was probably a little closer to downtown. So this one seems a bit of a compromise, but they didn't complete the building, or they didn't build the building until 1926. So just a lovely picture of downtown Revelstoke taken around 1962 when the old Imperial Bank was still there before it was replaced by the current CIBC. And just a couple of pictures here to show what Farwell looked like after it was no longer the business area. This was Farwell Park, which is still there, of course, now holds our lovely splash park. And it was built in 1962, around the time that the Trans-Canada Highway opened, as to provide a little park area close to the highway. And on this one, you can see Farwell School, which was built in 1955. This was the burning down of a lumber mill on Front Street that had been owned by the Mckenzie family. After a lot of the businesses moved out of that area, there was a lot of empty land. And so there was actually a sawmill that operated there for some time. But of course, now all of Farwell is residential. This was the RCMP building that opened where the Revelstoke Art Gallery is now in 1967. So there you have it, a little bit of history about Farwell, and hope you enjoyed our talk today. Thank you.